I stood in the courthouse hallway, gripping the envelope that had changed everything, watching through the glass doors as Kenneth Stewart adjusted his tie and prepared to destroy the only chance I had at belonging somewhere. The inheritance papers felt fragile in my trembling hands, and I could hear my Uncle Frank Kelly's voice echoing in my mind from the letter I'd memorized word for word. You are worth more than they ever told you, Jonathan. This land is yours by right, by blood, by love you never knew existed. But Kenneth Stewart, Frank's nephew by marriage, had other plans. He'd contested the will the moment he learned about me, claiming Frank was mentally incompetent when he wrote it, that an orphan had no business inheriting a 300-acre ranch in Montana. As I watched him through the glass, straightening his expensive suit and checking his Rolex, I knew this moment would determine whether I'd finally have a home or up in the rest of my life wondering what might have been. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all started, to that gray December morning when everything I thought I knew about my life crumbled and rebuilt itself in the span of 5 minutes. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. I was 18 years old, officially aged out of the St. Mary's Children's Home in Chicago, sitting on the front steps with a garbage bag containing everything I owned. The social worker, Martha Ruiz, had handed me a bus ticket to nowhere in particular and wished me luck. That's how it works when you turn 18 in the system. One day you're a ward of the state, the next you're on your own with a high school diploma and a prayer. I'd been at St. Mary's since I was 3 years old. My mother had dropped me off with nothing but a note that said my father was dead and she couldn't take care of me anymore. No last name for him, no family contacts, nothing. For 15 years, I'd been Jonathan Sanchez, the kid nobody wanted. Families would come looking for babies, toddlers, maybe a cute 8-year-old, but a sullen teenager with trust issues and a chip on his shoulder. That was a harder sell. I'd stopped hoping for adoption around my 13th birthday, stopped believing that somewhere out there was a family with my name on it. The morning I left St. Mary's, I was planning to catch a bus to Milwaukee, where I'd heard there were factory jobs that didn't ask too many questions about your background. I had $237 in my pocket, money I'd saved from odd jobs around the neighborhood, and a fierce determination to prove wrong every adult who'd ever looked at me with pity. I was going to make something of myself, even if I had to do it completely alone. That's when Donald Howard from the post office found me on those steps. Donald was a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd been delivering mail to St. Mary's for as long as I could remember. He always had a kind word for the kids, always treated us like we mattered. When he saw me sitting there with my garbage bag, he knew exactly what was happening. We'd all seen it before, kids aging out, disappearing into the world with nothing but hope and stubbornness to sustain them. Donald, I thought you might want to see this before you leave, he said, pulling an envelope from his mailbag. It's addressed to Jonathan Sanchez, care of St. Mary's Children's Home. Been sitting in our dead letter office for 3 weeks because nobody could figure out who it was for. Took me a while to realize it might be you. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper that felt expensive between my fingers. The return address made my heart stop. Frank Kelly, Whitefish, Montana. I'd never heard the name before. Never been to Montana. Had no idea who Frank Kelly was or why he'd be writing to me. But there it was, my name written in careful handwriting across the front, as if someone had taken great care to make sure it reached me. I opened it right there on the steps, with Donald watching and Martha Ruiz coming back outside to see what was keeping me. Inside was a letter dated 3 months earlier in a smaller sealed envelope marked to be opened only by Jonathan Sanchez. The letter began simply, Dear Jonathan, you don't know me, but I'm your uncle, your father's brother. Your father was my younger brother Miguel, though he went by Michael when he moved to Chicago. He died in a construction accident when you were 2 years old, and I've been looking for you ever since. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the words. I had a father. His name was Miguel. Michael. He had a brother who'd been looking for me for 16 years. Frank's letter continued, explaining how he'd hired private investigators, how he'd searched through records and followed dead-end leads, how he'd never given up hope of finding his brother's son. He'd learned about my mother abandoning me, about my time in the system, about everything I'd been through. And he was sorry, so deeply sorry that it had taken him this long to find me. But Jonathan, the letter continued, I found you now, and I want you to know that you have family. You have a place to belong. I own a ranch outside Whitefish, Montana, 300 acres of the most beautiful land you've ever seen. Cattle, horses, a farmhouse that's been in our family for 3 generations. It's yours, son, all of it. I'm getting old. I have no children of my own, and this land needs someone young and strong to care for it, someone with Kelly blood in their veins. I read that letter 3 times before the words sank in. Martha Ruiz was reading over my shoulder, her eyes getting wider with each paragraph. Donald was grinning like he'd personally delivered Christmas morning, and I was trying to process the fact that somewhere in Montana, there was a man who'd been searching for me my entire life, who wanted to give me everything he owned simply because I was his brother's son. The smaller envelope contained legal documents, property deeds, and a bank statement showing an account with my name on it containing $50,000. There was also a key, old and brass, worn smooth by decades of use. A note attached to it read, "This is the key to your grandfather's house, the house where your father grew up, the house where you belong. Come home, Jonathan. Come home and claim what's yours." But there was one more thing in that envelope that changed everything. A death certificate. Frank Kelly had died 2 weeks after writing the letter, which explained why it had taken so long to reach me. Heart attack, sudden and massive. The man who'd spent 16 years looking for me had found me just in time to give me everything, but too late for us to ever meet. I sat on those steps and cried for the first time since I was 12 years old, mourning an uncle I'd never known and a father whose name I'd just learned. Martha helped me understand the legal implications. Frank's will was clear and properly executed. He'd left everything to me, his only living relative, with one condition. I had to live on the ranch for at least 1 year and work the land. If I did that, it would be mine, free and clear. If I didn't, it would be sold and the proceeds donated to charity. It was his way of making sure the land went to someone who would love it the way he had, someone who understood that owning land meant more than just holding a deed. The bus ticket to Milwaukee went in the trash. I used some of Frank's money to buy a Greyhound ticket to Whitefish, Montana, and spent the 36-hour journey reading and rereading his letter, trying to imagine the life that was waiting for me. I'd never been west of Illinois, never seen mountains or wide open spaces. The closest I'd come to farming was helping tend the small garden behind St. Mary's. But Frank believed I could do it, believed I had Kelly blood and Kelly determination. And for the first time in my life, someone's faith in me felt like enough. The bus pulled into Whitefish on a Tuesday morning in January, and I stepped off into a world that looked nothing like Chicago. Snow-covered mountains surrounded a small town that seemed to exist in a different century. Main Street was lined with buildings that looked like they'd been there since the 1800s, and the air was so clean and cold it made my lungs ache. I'd never experienced silence like that, the kind of quiet that comes from being surrounded by wilderness instead of concrete and traffic. I found a taxi driver named Brandon Torres who knew exactly where the Kelly Ranch was located. "Been wondering when someone would come claim that place," he said as we drove out of town. Frank was a good man, kept to himself mostly, but always helped his neighbors when they needed it. Shame he died so young. Only 72, had a lot of life left in him. Brandon filled me in on the local gossip during the 20-minute drive. Frank had been respected in the community, known for his fair dealing and his beautiful horses. The ranch had been in the family since the 1920s, when Frank's father had bought it from a failing cattle operation and built it into something special. When we turned down the dirt road marked with a weathered sign reading Kelly Ranch, my heart started pounding. This was it. This was the place my father had grown up, the place Frank had wanted me to call home. The road wound through stands of pine and aspen, past snow-covered pastures where I could see cattle huddled together for warmth. And then, around a bend, I saw it, the house. It was a 2-story log home with a wraparound porch and green metal roof, nestled against a backdrop of mountains that took my breath away. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which seemed impossible since Frank had been dead for months. As we pulled up to the front porch, the door opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "You must be Jonathan," she said before I could even get out of the taxi. "I'm Jessica Rogers. I've been taking care of the place since Frank passed, making sure the pipes didn't freeze and the cattle got fed. Been waiting for you to show up." Brandon helped me carry my single garbage bag to the porch and refused my offer to pay him. "Welcome home, kid," he said. Frank would be proud. Then he drove away, leaving me standing in the snow with Jessica Rogers, who was studying me with the kind of intense scrutiny I'd grown used to from social workers and potential foster parents. "You look like him," she said finally. "Like your father." Frank showed me pictures. Miguel was a handsome boy, charming as they come. Broke a lot of hearts when he left for Chicago. "Come on inside before we both freeze to death. We've got a lot to talk about." The inside of the house was warm and welcoming in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. Everything was wood and stone and soft lighting, with family photographs covering the mantel and bookshelves lining the walls. Jessica led me to the kitchen, where she poured coffee from a pot that smelled like it had been brewing for hours. She'd been Frank's neighbor for 30 years, she explained, and when he got sick, she'd promised to look after things until his nephew arrived. "Frank talked about you constantly those last few years," Jessica said, settling into a chair across from me. "Once he found out where you were, once he knew you were alive and well, it was all he could think about. He had such plans for this place, such dreams about what you two would build together. It broke his heart that he ran out of time." She showed me through the house, room by room, pointing out the details Frank had wanted me to know. The bedroom that had been my father's, still decorated with rodeo trophies and high school photographs. The study where Frank kept the ranch records, meticulously organized and up to date. The living room with its massive stone fireplace, where Frank had spent his evenings reading and planning improvements to the property. But it was when we reached the kitchen table that I found the real treasure. A stack of letters, all addressed to me, all written by Frank during the months before his death. Jessica explained that he'd written them after his first heart attack, when he realized he might not live long enough to teach me everything I needed to know about running the ranch. Each letter covered a different topic: how to care for the cattle in winter, which neighbors could be trusted and which ones to watch out for, the history of every building on the property, and the stories behind them. The first letter I opened was dated just a week before his death. "Jonathan," it began, "I hope by the time you read this, you're sitting in the kitchen where your father ate breakfast every morning before school, where your grandfather taught him to play chess, where 3 generations of Kelly men learned what it means to work the land. You belong here, son, not because of blood, though that matters, but because this place needs someone who understands what it means to start over, what it means to build something from nothing." I spent that first night reading Frank's letters by the fireplace, with Jessica checking on me periodically and making sure I had everything I needed. She'd prepared the master bedroom for me, but I ended up falling asleep on the couch, surrounded by photographs and letters, and the overwhelming sense that I'd finally found the place I was meant to be. For the first time in my life, I was sleeping in a house that belonged to me, on land that carried my name, surrounded by the love of a family I'd never known existed. The next morning, Jessica introduced me to the practical realities of ranch life. The cattle needed to be fed, the horses needed water, and the generator that powered the well pump was making concerning noises. I'd never done any of these things before, but Jessica was patient and thorough, showing me how to break ice on the water troughs, how to distribute hay to the cattle, how to check the horses for injuries or illness. It was hard work, harder than anything I'd ever done, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. These animals depended on me. This land was counting on me to care for it properly. For someone who'd spent 18 years being nobody's responsibility, the weight of that trust was both terrifying and exhilarating. By the end of my first week, I'd settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Up before dawn to tend the animals, breakfast while reading one of Frank's letters, then tackling whatever project Jessica deemed most urgent. Repairing fence posts, cleaning out the barn, learning to operate the tractor that Frank had left in perfect working condition. My hands were raw and blistered, my back ached constantly, but I'd never felt more alive. That's when Kenneth Stewart showed up. I was in the barn, trying to figure out why one of the horses seemed to be favoring her left front leg, when I heard a car pull up outside. Through the barn door, I could see an expensive black sedan, the kind of car that looked out of place on a working ranch. A man in a suit climbed out, followed by a woman carrying a briefcase. They both had the predatory look of people who made their living taking things away from other people. "You must be Jonathan Sanchez," the man said when I walked outside. "I'm Kenneth Stewart, Frank's nephew. This is my lawyer, Barbara Phillips. We need to talk." Kenneth was in his 40s, soft around the middle, with the kind of manicured appearance that suggested he'd never done a day of manual labor in his life. He looked around the ranch with the calculating gaze of someone assessing property values, and when his eyes landed on me, I could see exactly what he was thinking. "What's a kid from the projects doing on my family's land?" "Frank mentioned you in his letters," I said carefully. "You're his sister's son." "That's right," Kenneth replied, "which makes me his closest living relative. At least, I was until you conveniently appeared. I have to say, the timing is interesting. Frank dies and suddenly a long-lost nephew shows up to claim his inheritance. Makes a person wonder." I felt my temper flare, but Jessica's hand on my arm kept me calm. She'd come out of the house when she heard the car, and her presence was reassuring. Kenneth's lawyer, Barbara Phillips, was already taking photographs of the property, making notes on a tablet. They'd come prepared for something, though I wasn't sure what. "What exactly are you implying?" I asked. "I'm not implying anything," Kenneth said. "I'm stating facts. Frank was 72 years old, in poor health, and emotionally vulnerable after his heart attack. He was also heavily medicated, which can affect judgment and decision-making. The fact that he suddenly decided to leave everything to a stranger he'd never met, instead of his own family, suggests he wasn't thinking clearly." "Frank spent 16 years looking for Jonathan," Jessica interjected. "This wasn't a sudden decision. He hired investigators, searched through records, never gave up hope of finding his brother's son. Jonathan isn't a stranger. He's family." Kenneth's smile was cold. "According to who? A letter from a dead man, some documents that could have been forged. Do we have any proof that this young man is actually related to Frank? Do we have DNA tests, birth certificates, anything that proves Miguel Sanchez was really Frank's brother?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. In all my excitement about finding family, about inheriting the ranch, I hadn't considered that someone might question my legitimacy. Kenneth was right about one thing. I had no proof beyond Frank's letter and the documents he had left behind. No birth certificate listing my father's name, no DNA evidence, nothing that would stand up in court if someone chose to challenge it. Barbara Phillips stepped forward, handing me a legal document. "We're contesting the will," she said in a voice that suggested she'd done this many times before. Frank Kelly was not of sound mind when he wrote this document. He was grieving, medicated, and vulnerable to manipulation. The inheritance should go to his legitimate family members, not to someone who showed up after his death claiming to be a relative. I stared at the papers, trying to process what was happening. 24 hours ago, I'd been an orphan with nothing. Then I discovered I had family, that I'd inherited a ranch, that I finally had a place to belong. Now someone was trying to take it all away, claiming I was a fraud who'd somehow manipulated a dying man I'd never met. "You have 30 days to respond to the contest," Barbara continued. "I'd suggest you hire a lawyer, though I should warn you that fighting this will be expensive and time-consuming. It might be easier for everyone if you simply walked away. I'm sure Kenneth would be willing to compensate you for your trouble." "How much?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Kenneth smiled, clearly thinking he'd found my price. $25,000. Ish. Enough to start over somewhere else. Build a life for yourself. All you have to do is sign a document relinquishing any claim to Frank's estate. I looked around the ranch at the mountains and the pastures and the house where my father had grown up. I thought about Frank's letters, about his 16-year search for me, about his faith that I could learn to love this land the way he had. And I thought about every adult who'd ever looked at me and seen nothing but a problem to be managed, a burden to be shifted somewhere else. "No," I said finally, "this is my home. Frank wanted me to have it, and I'm not going anywhere." Kenneth's friendly mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "We'll see about that," he said. "Barbara, file the papers. Let's see how long this kid's determination lasts when he's facing real legal bills." They drove away in their expensive car, leaving me standing in the snow, with Jessica and a growing sense of dread. I'd thought the hard part was over, that finding my family and claiming my inheritance was the end of the struggle, but it was just the beginning. That night, Jessica helped me understand what I was up against. Kenneth Stewart was a successful real estate developer who specialized in buying rural properties and converting them into vacation resorts. He'd been pressuring Frank to sell the ranch for years, offering increasingly large sums of money. Frank had always refused, but Kenneth had never given up hope that he'd eventually inherit the property and be able to develop it. The legal contest would be expensive and complicated. Kenneth had money and connections, while I had nothing but Frank's letters and my own determination. But Jessica knew someone who might be able to help. Olivia Peterson was a lawyer in Whitefish who specialized in estate disputes. She'd grown up on a ranch herself and understood what the land meant to families like the Kellys. More importantly, she had a reputation for taking on cases that others considered unwinnable. I met Olivia the next morning in her office above the town's only coffee shop. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that made me feel like she was seeing straight through to my soul. She listened carefully as I told her my story, occasionally asking questions about dates and details. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. "Kenneth Stewart is a shark," she said finally. "He's contested 3 other wills in the past 5 years, and he's won 2 of them. He knows how to make legitimate heirs look like opportunists, how to cast doubt on family relationships, how to drag cases out until the other side runs out of money. But he's also arrogant, and arrogant people make mistakes. Can you help me?" I asked. Olivia smiled. "I can try, but I need you to understand what you're signing up for. This case could take months, maybe years. Kenneth will attack your character, your background, your relationship to Frank. He'll paint you as a con artist who took advantage of a sick old man. It's going to get ugly, and it's going to get personal." I thought about the alternative. Walking away, taking Kenneth's money, spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Going back to being nobody, belonging nowhere, having nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge that I'd given up the only family I'd ever found. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her. "This is my home, and I'm going to fight for it." Olivia's first move was to request Frank's medical records to prove that he was mentally competent when he wrote the will. Kenneth had claimed Frank was heavily medicated and emotionally compromised, but the records told a different story. Frank had been on mild heart medication, nothing that would affect his judgment. His doctor confirmed that he'd been lucid and alert right up until his final heart attack. Next, Olivia tracked down the private investigator Frank had hired to find me. Donald Howard, the mailman who delivered Frank's letter, provided testimony about Frank's years-long search for his nephew. Jessica and several other neighbors testified about Frank's excitement when he finally located me, about his plans for teaching me to run the ranch, about his mental state in the months before his death. But the breakthrough came when Olivia discovered something Kenneth had overlooked. Frank's father, my grandfather, had kept detailed family records. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, military service records, everything documenting the Kelly family history. And there, in a trunk in the ranch house attic, was my father's birth certificate. Miguel Kelly, born in Whitefish, Montana, son of Patrick and Mary Kelly. He'd changed his name to Sanchez when he moved to Chicago, probably to fit in better with the Hispanic community there, but the blood connection was undeniable. The court hearing was scheduled for a cold February morning, and I spent the night before reading Frank's letters one more time. In one of them, he'd written about the first time his father had taken him to court to settle a boundary dispute with a neighbor. "Your grandfather taught me that day that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against you, especially when the odds are against you. That's what separates the Kelly men from everyone else. We don't back down." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wooden benches that looked like they'd been there since the building was constructed. Kenneth sat at one table with Barbara Phillips and 2 other lawyers, all of them in expensive suits and confident expressions. Olivia and I sat at the other table, just the 2 of us, but I felt Frank's presence as strongly as if he'd been sitting beside me. Barbara Phillips presented Kenneth's case first. She painted Frank as a lonely, sick old man who'd been manipulated by a con artist pretending to be his nephew. She questioned the timing of my appearance, suggesting I'd somehow learned about Frank's wealth and concocted an elaborate scheme to steal his inheritance. She presented medical records showing Frank's heart condition, prescription medications, and periods of depression following his diagnosis. But when Olivia stood up to present our case, everything changed. She methodically destroyed Kenneth's arguments, presenting evidence of Frank's mental competence, his 16-year search for me, and most importantly, the family records proving my connection to the Kelly bloodline. She called Jessica Rogers to testify about Frank's excitement when he found me, about his detailed plans for my future on the ranch, about his clear and consistent mental state right up until his death. The judge, an elderly man named Cynthia Brooks, who'd been on the bench for 30 years, listened carefully to both sides. When the testimony was finished, she asked me to stand. "Young man," she said, "this court has heard compelling evidence that you are indeed Frank Kelly's nephew, and that he was of sound mind when he wrote his will. But I want to hear from you directly. Why should this ranch be yours? What makes you worthy of Frank Kelly's trust?" I thought about everything that had led me to that moment. 18 years in the foster system, the loneliness and rejection, the constant feeling of being unwanted and unwelcome. Then finding Frank's letter, discovering I had family, learning that someone had been searching for me my entire life. I thought about the early mornings feeding cattle, the satisfaction of hard work, the way the land felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. "Your Honor," I said, "Frank Kelly spent 16 years looking for me, not because he owed me anything, but because he believed family matters. He believed this land needed someone who would love it and care for it the way he did. I can't promise I'll be perfect at it. I'm still learning, still making mistakes. But I can promise that every day I wake up on that ranch, I'll remember that someone believed in me enough to give me everything he had, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that trust." Judge Brooks nodded slowly. "The court finds that Frank Kelly was mentally competent, when he executed his will, and that Jonathan Sanchez is his legitimate nephew and heir. The will contest is denied. Mr. Sanchez, the ranch is yours." Kenneth Stewart's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to anger to calculation. As we left the courthouse, he caught up with me in the parking lot. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You might have won today, but you're just a kid with no experience and no money. Running a ranch is hard work, and most people who inherit land like this end up selling within 5 years. When you're ready to give up, when the work gets too hard and the bills pile up, I'll still be here, and my offer will still stand." "Maybe," I replied, "but Frank believed I could do this, and that's enough for me." Spring came early that year, and with it came the real test of whether I could make the ranch work. Jessica had been patient with my inexperience through the winter, but now it was time to prove I could handle the responsibility on my own. Calving season meant sleepless nights checking on pregnant cows, learning to assist with difficult births, making life and death decisions about animals worth thousands of dollars. I made mistakes, lost a calf to pneumonia because I didn't recognize the symptoms quickly enough, let the horses get into the grain storage and nearly killed one with colic, forgot to check fence lines and spent 2 days rounding up cattle that had wandered onto the neighbor's property. But with each mistake came learning, and with each success came confidence. The neighbors who'd been skeptical of the city kid gradually began to accept me. Brandon Torres, the taxi driver who'd brought me from the bus station, started stopping by to check on me and offer advice. The feed store owner, a gruff man named Frank Kelly, wait, that was my uncle. I mean Donald Howard. No, that was the mailman. Let me get this straight. The feed store owner, a man named Kenneth, no, that's the villain. The feed store owner, whose name I should have established earlier, became a valuable source of information about cattle nutrition and veterinary care. By summer, I'd found my rhythm. Up at 5 to check the animals, breakfast while reading the ranch records Frank had kept so meticulously, then whatever work the day demanded. Haying, fence repair, equipment maintenance, all the 1,000 small tasks that keep a ranch running. My hands were permanently calloused now. My back had adapted to the constant physical demands. And I developed the kind of deep tan that comes from spending every daylight hour outdoors. But the real transformation was internal. For the first time in my life, I had purpose beyond mere survival. These cattle depended on me. This land trusted me to care for it properly. Frank's legacy lived through my daily choices about how to manage the ranch he'd built with his own hands. One evening in late summer, I was sitting on the front porch reading one of Frank's letters when Jessica Rogers drove up with a surprise. She'd been going through some boxes in her attic and found something that belonged on the ranch. It was a photograph album filled with pictures of the Kelly family going back 4 generations. My great-grandfather breaking ground for the original house. My grandfather as a young man, standing proudly next to his first tractor. My father as a boy, riding horses and helping with cattle, growing up on the land that was now mine. But the most precious discovery was a letter my father had written to Frank just before he left for Chicago. In it, Miguel talked about his dreams of seeing the world beyond Montana, but also about his promise to return someday with a family of his own. He wanted his future children to grow up on the ranch, to learn the values and work ethic that had shaped the Kelly men for generations. Reading that letter, I finally understood why Frank had searched for me so relentlessly. It wasn't just about blood or inheritance. It was about completing a promise, honoring a dream that had been interrupted by tragedy. My father had wanted his children to know this land, and through Frank's determination, his wish had finally come true. As autumn arrived and I prepared for my second winter on the ranch, I realized how completely my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been an 18-year-old orphan with nothing but a garbage bag of belongings and a bus ticket to nowhere. Now I own 300 acres of some of the most beautiful land in Montana. I had neighbors who respected me, work that challenged and fulfilled me, and a sense of belonging I'd never imagined possible. Kenneth Stewart had been wrong about one thing. I wasn't going to give up. Every morning when I stepped outside and saw the mountains rising above the pastures where my cattle grazed, every evening when I sat in the kitchen where my father had eaten breakfast as a boy, I felt Frank's presence in my father's dreams. This wasn't just my home now. It was my responsibility, my legacy, my chance to prove that sometimes the system gets it wrong, that sometimes the kid nobody wanted grows up to be exactly who he was meant to be. The ranch is thriving now, 5 years later. I've expanded the herd, improved the facilities, and even started boarding horses for city folks who want their animals to have a taste of country life. Jessica Rogers still stops by regularly, more as a friend now than a caretaker, and she often tells me how proud Frank would be of what I've accomplished. But the real measure of success isn't in the financial statements or the improved infrastructure. It's in the knowledge that I've kept faith with Frank's vision, honored my father's dreams, and built something lasting on the foundation they provided. I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who believe in you, who invest in your future, who trust you with their legacy even when you've never met. To anyone out there who feels like they don't belong anywhere, who thinks they're not worthy of love or trust or investment, I want you to know that you're wrong. Somewhere out there is your Frank Kelly, your person who sees potential where others see problems. Sometimes it takes 18 years to find them. Sometimes it comes in a letter from someone you've never met, but it's out there waiting for you. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt lost or unwanted or like you didn't belong anywhere, I'd love to hear from you. Share your own stories of finding family, of discovering where you belong, of proving wrong the people who underestimated you. Subscribe to hear more stories like this, and remember that your worth isn't determined by where you started, but by how you choose to finish. Home isn't just a place. It's a feeling, a choice, a daily commitment to being worthy of the love and trust people place in you. The Kelly Ranch is still my home, and it always will be. Awes.